Every day in the newspapers, we are reading news about the land rights movement, allegedly being pursued on behalf of Aborigines. We have even read in the newspapers, several times since last November, of how people claiming to represent the Aboriginal nation have been to the United Nations Human Rights Commission seeking the support of that outside body to take Australia to the International Court of Justice in order to question our right to the sovereignty of Australia, to in fact declare that the Aborigines are entitled to self-determination, which in the terms of international law means their right to secede. And it also would mean that the Aboriginal people in fact had sovereignty all over Australia. In the United Nations, evidence is being piled up against our country from all sorts of people, including such as Al Grasby, people like Charlie Perkins, alleging that the Australian people are racist, which they are not. They are among the most tolerant, if not the most tolerant people in the world. Parliament is divided over debates on the issue. Now, the point about all this is that the background to it, the reasons for this movement, which is neither in the interests of the Aborigines or the white people, is something that people discuss every day. And in particular, those people who have either a responsibility for the defence of the country or the average citizen who is now becoming deeply agitated about what all this is about. And they come to debate this issue and to explore its significance from various backgrounds. I can only tell you of my own background and my own concern about it, and that is because I grew up as a member of the Communist Party, in the sense that my father was a member, and as a child I believed in those views, and as soon as I was old enough, which is 18, I became a member myself. And I remained a member for 13 years. Now, one of the points I would make about the Communist Party is that apart from the fact that everyone had to be active and to participate in their work, they all went through a very intensive campaign of education. You can call it indoctrination, brainwashing, or whatever you like. But I doubt if I spent a week of those 13 years in which I did not take part in some form of study. Usually a class once a week, perhaps of only an hour. But then you would have fortnightly classes. Sometimes you would take off work and go away to school for even 6 weeks at a time, such as what was then the secret communist training school in Minto, New South Wales. They taught historical and dialectical materialism, Marxian economics, philosophy, strategy and tactics. But there was one theory that I never took at all seriously. Being in Melbourne and also being based in the union movement and not seeing much or knowing much about Aborigines, we were taught about the theory of the national and the colonial question. It had been developed by Joseph Stalin under the instructions of Lenin. Now, put simply, that theory was that the best way to achieve power in any country that had Indigenous peoples, such as in Australia with our Aborigines, was to start what you would call an anti-colonial movement for the Indigenous peoples to regain their land. Linked with that were issues of promoting so-called multiculturalism and multiracialism, which would break the homogeneity of the nation, which then allowed the communists to take power. Now, with regard to the Aborigines, I never, as I said, took this very seriously. And it wasn't until several years after I was expelled from the party, that was in 1960, that I started to read in the newspapers about the developing land rights movement, claims being made by Aborigines, sympathetic newspaper editorials, and so on. And I started to think to myself, good heavens, this is the theory that we were taught about in the Communist Party. And of course, another nudge to make a person with my background wake up to what was happening is that some of the people you would see speaking allegedly on behalf of the Aborigines on the television would be people that you'd grown up with in the Communist Party. And as I said, I've been in the trade union movement all my life. And when you work at the Trades Hall, you're never away from communist propaganda and literature. And in any case, being a former communist, you still read their material to study the course and direction of their activities. And it became very clear to me how communists were manipulating this movement. On top of this, in 1970, I took on the position of Industrial Relations Officer for the Royal Australian Nursing Federation. My job with them was to have nurses' salaries increased to a level that would give them professional recognition, penalty rates, etc. So that in 1970, I went to the Northern Territory to study the first brief that I had to prepare on their behalf. And that was for what Aborigines should be, nurses should be paid who work with Aborigines. And in studying the nurses' work in a cross-cultural situation, there again, I actually saw communists in operation. Communist literature was all around the settlements. And then again in 1972, when the Whitlam government came to office, they introduced the policy they called self-determination. Now, self-determination in international law means the right to secede. But the way it was sold to the people was that self-determination was merely to give the Aborigines more control over their own affairs, more dignity and autonomy, which most people would not argue about. And that was not really the issue. But what we had to confront and deal with as a nurses' organisation was that in the name of self-determination, Charlie Perkins and these people promoted and got going a move to throw the police off the settlements. And we had the problem that under Aboriginal law, that it has no way of coping with the problem of alcohol. And as a result of the spread of alcohol among Aborigines and the consequent violence, and the absence of police who used to do a very good and sympathetic job for which they were supported by the Aboriginal leaders in stopping fights and in stopping killings. As Whitlam's program proceeded, there was deaths on the settlements in the Northern Territory, and some nurses were having spears thrown at them. And myself and other officials of the Royal Australian Nursing Federation became heavily involved in disputation with the government, in negotiations with ministers, in visiting settlements. And throughout the rest of Australia, we would receive correspondence from nurses deeply troubled by what was happening. We would have deputations from Aborigines themselves. One example I'll cite, just by way of evidence, was at Yuendumu, a settlement about 120 miles from Alice Springs, where apart from the fact that the Aborigines themselves were supporting the nurses and asking us for support to bring the police back to stop violence, we also had appeals from Aborigines to stop having their compatriots who were Christians being beaten up for going to a Christian church. It was the first time I realised that there was such a controversy. And the nurses used to tell us how they'd say, well, look, that crowd over there, or that tribal group or settlement, we never have any trouble there because they're all Christians. And I again got quite involved in that, although I never understood the full issues. Now, in order to try and get this message across to the Australian public as to what was taking place and what were the objectives of the communist movement, I wrote a book called Red Over Black. And in it, what I've done is to mainly quote material that was readily available to the average citizen, that he could check through newspaper files, through local libraries. I quoted only a few communist textbooks, but as well as that, dealing with my own experience. Since then, because of the number of questions I've received, and I quite understand that people would wonder and be incredulous about how clever and how highly involved the communist movement is in our society and how it has been directing this land rights movement. So that I have produced another book, a smaller book called The Evidence. Now in that, I've gone through the communist archives that are in the Mitchell Library in Sydney and in other libraries, but I mention the Mitchell Library particularly because you can find almost everything there, in which they have got all of the newspapers, journals, textbooks and other theoretical material from the communist movement since 1920. And I've shown in this little book how the communists themselves, in order to explain to their own members what they had to do, explained how the ultimate objective is the establishment of a new, separate, independent nation of Aborigines. And they say it in those very words, that that so-called Aboriginal nation is to be recognised by countries outside Australia, that they are to have their own army. Now, we all appreciate the fact that the Aborigines neither have the numerical strength, supposing they even wanted this sort of thing, to establish an army. But the idea of an army on land rights areas is to bring in uninvited Asian and other so-called refugees or migrants. Again, that is very well documented from their own sources. Now, as I said, we are discussing a question of Australia's defence and its security, the importance of which cannot be underestimated and concerns the interests of every Australian, their children and the children in the future. It also concerns the welfare of the Aborigines who are being manipulated by these white communist activists. Now, one of the reasons they have been able to get away with this for so long is that they've got a trigger word, McCarthyism. Even though, as you will be able to see when you read the evidence, all red over black, by checking what I've said in that book, and I appeal to people to check the accuracy or otherwise of what I'm saying, and that's why the original sources are quoted. But you will see there how they explain very clearly how they've been organising Aborigines into the communist movement, how they've been developing programs on behalf of Aborigines, and the point is that you will find the names of people there mentioned. People like Don McLeod, who've been working among the Aborigines there for many, many years. I remember once when I was first in the Communist Party, they were calling for volunteers to go and work among the Aborigines. Again, I never took that at all seriously, being a union official. But in using that trigger word racism, they try and push people into a position of moral cowardice or fear, such as they do by using the trigger word racism, as a cover to their activities. Probably the classic example of this that we've seen in Australia has been in the case of the Queensland Premier Joe Bulgeki-Peterson, who's one politician who has spoke out openly on this issue. He's shown an understanding of what it is all about and has spoken in the defence of Australia. Now, you see these particularly in the southern states, cartoons of Joe Bulgeki-Peterson looking like Frankenstein. The Queensland people are supposed to be part of the deep north, something like an alleged Ku Klux Klan area in the southern part of the United States, none of which reflects accuracy. Fortunately, people are now beginning to wake up to this. You've got the Returned Servicemen's League have shown that they are sick to death of this use of the term McCarthyism. People are now beginning to understand just how that has stopped them from thinking about the defence of their own country and their own security. Now, one of the problems I found myself is that in getting to people, that is to get your message across, that you've got to have organisation. And I'm dealing here with the role of the Labor Party. Now, I was told while a member of the Labor Party in Victoria that I could no longer renew my ticket because they wouldn't tolerate anybody in that party going around speaking about the alternative case on land rights and raising these issues from a defence point of view. So without the support of the Labor Party or even the right to speak within their party, it became a question of seeing who else would help. Now, I had the problem of publishing a book, getting people to support it and so on. And the first politician I went to see was Joe Peterson. I had certainly tested out a few others. And he did the right thing as a politician. He got me to write out a very lengthy statement in which I had to explain all of my views, my own background, and I had to sign every page, which he then submitted to the Queensland Parliament, which was put in Hansard so that anybody could check what I've been saying. Nobody has been able to counter that by way of ridicule, that is at least ridicule of the facts. It then became a question of being able to go out and talk to the people. Now, I went to the Liberal Party, particularly in Western Australia, where a lot of members of that party gave support by promoting meetings. In fact, I've been to just about everybody. I've had excellent support from members of the National Party up in Queensland and including Western Australia, and other individual National Party branches and Liberal Party branches throughout the Commonwealth. I've spoken to innumerable church groups of all different persuasions. I've spoken to everybody from the League of Rights, who've really given me excellent support in this campaign. I've gone back and I've spoken to many of my union colleagues. I've addressed Australian Council of Trade Union conferences, meetings of the Trades and Labour Council and so on. And one of the methods that the communists have been using to try and stop me and other people from speaking out about these issues is to use the smear technique of this McCarthyism, racist, etc. And it should be on a moment's reflection. When you hear this word racism, you should remember that they are also talking about you. They'll say some organisation or politician or individual is a racist to try and get the rest of Australians not to listen to their views. And at the same time, they are supporting this application before the United Nations to try and say that the Australian people as a whole are racists, and it is a weapon being used against us. I therefore put it to you strongly that as a defence matter, Australians have all got to consider how these trigger words McCarthyism and racism are used to stop them from thinking about the real issues. Now, one of the problems that we have in unions from time to time is that there are important legal questions that have to be discussed. Often it might be an amendment to the Arbitration Act, the union's rules, a demarcation dispute, or something else. But the legal questions involved are so important that they have to be explained to the entire membership. Now, if you were in the position that somebody was trying to frame you up as an individual on some charge or other, you would be forced, in order to defend yourself, to study the law books. Now, in this case, Australia is in the world scene, being charged with so-called racism and the oppression of a minority of people, the Aborigines, which is patently untrue. And the smears are not being supported by 99 out of every 100 Australians. But because the United Nations is being geared up as an instrument to recognise the land rights areas as an independent nation and to impose sanctions, which is now being openly discussed against Australia like they did in Rhodesia, then it is incumbent upon all Australians to have at least some knowledge of the international legal arguments being used against us and how they should be countered. Now, I said earlier that the argument about the Aborigines having sovereignty over Australia involves questions of international law. We have before Parliament at the present time a resolution being put by the Labor government in which they state that they are prepared to recognise that Australia was taken by conquest. That means that this government is saying they are prepared to state that the British government invaded Australia and took it from the Aborigines. Now, nobody is denying that the Aborigines lived in Australia prior to the coming of the white man. But if in terms of international law, and I ask you to consider that we're only talking about the meaning of words in international law, if we say that the Aborigines owned and occupied Australia, it means that they had an organised, civilised society such as we would equate with a nation-state or a group of nations. In Victoria, the government there introduced a bill in which the first thing they said was that we recognise the prior ownership and occupation of Australia by the Aborigines. Now, that's the type of evidence that is being used against Australia in the United Nations to say that we live here illegally. And it is the basis of the new campaign being run by the Marxists involved in manipulating the land rights movement, is that they are saying that we now have to pay the rent for the right to live here outside of the land rights areas. I have another book coming out on international law which gives the detail from their original sources, which you would be able to read to check on what I am saying. But any citizen reading the daily newspapers will be able to pick up this information. Unfortunately, the issue is not being debated into clarity in our parliament any more than the real issues behind Asian and the new wave of Negro migration being introduced to Australia by the government is being discussed. Now, again, there are publications that should be studied by the serious student, and in our period now, where it's like a bushfire in which all citizens should be asked to play their part in putting out the blaze, it is necessary for them to also know how to check the original sources if they so desire. One of the main publications being used to break Australia's security is a journal called Australian Quarterly. It's got out by the Australian Institute of Political Science, so-called. You can obtain this from 32 Market Street, Sydney, or you can get it from your library. And if your library hasn't got it, then get them to order it from the main public library in your capital city. The autumn 1983 issue has the most up-to-date plans of attack against Australia. Now, if you were a military person, you could never imagine anything better than to have the enemy's plans put in front of you. But in politics, we sometimes don't recognise what these plans are. So I recommend to you for study an article by Professor Colin Tatz of the Macquarie University in New South Wales. He is a lecturer in political science, and he has there an article headed Aborigines and the Age of Atonement. It is the most incredible diatribe I have ever read of hatred against the Australian people. It accuses Australians of racism, but most particularly it deals from someone on the other side as to how these legal arguments being used against us by claimants to represent the Aboriginal nation, both inside Australia and in United Nations organisations, he explains what they are about. He points out that in September 1975, that Mr. Neville Bonner got up in the House, that is in the Senate, and moved a resolution that the Australian government recognises prior ownership and occupation of Australia by the Aborigines, and that they should have reparations, etc. This has got nothing to do with giving a fair deal to the Aborigines. It is like the present resolution before the House of Representatives and the Senate by the Labor government, stating that they recognise Australia was taken by conquest. And he points out the fact that now that Clyde Holding has made statements to this effect, that that is the beginning of a historico-legal fight to come. And when you see in the newspapers about these applications being made against Australia, you've got some idea of knowing what it is about. It is to alter Australia's standing in international law. Now, I'm not suggesting that any of these arguments have got any valid basis at all. They haven't. But in Australia, you've got politicians based on such grotesque propositions as the Franklin Dam, that because we sign treaties or have agreements in the United Nations, that somehow allows our government, the federal government, to ride roughshod over the Constitution by using the external powers which the Commonwealth Government has under the Constitution to overrule the states. In the case of Tasmania, despite the fact that under a Labor government they had a referendum of the people in that state who voted overwhelmingly to build the dam, and then subsequently the grey Liberal government was elected who supported very strongly the building of the dam because they needed it for the economic development of their state. The Fraser government put the Franklin Dam area on the World Heritage List. Now, the World Heritage List is controlled by UNESCO, the United Nations Educational and Cultural Organisation, which the United States have said they are going to get out of because of its communist third world bias and its opposition to the Western civilisation. While the United States is taking this move and other countries ignore UNESCO and the so-called World Heritage List, we've had both the federal Liberal government and now the Hawke government saying that they have legal powers over us. This same Australian Quarterly Journal boasts, in a write-up of the judges in the High Court, who they say have left Liberal views, at least the majority of them, they say that the High Court can be expected to support other decisions, such as the Franklin Dam, and they would include that we have to abide by whatever the United States says about Aboriginal land rights. It is the basis of laws such as the so-called Sex Discrimination Bill, and so on. It is an attempt to take away the independence of Australia. Now, we've got a position that the revolution by instalments is being supported by politicians in our own government. I know of no such example, but it is the same type of fight against Australia as was waged against the former colonies of the British Empire, in particular Rhodesia and Kenya as an example. Now, I mentioned how when I was working for that nurses organisation, that the Aborigines who were Christians were victims of a persecution campaign, and that nurses had to put up with the government's proposition that they had to work with medicine men and all sorts of things to take the Aborigines back to the old culture. Now, last year, I was doing a tour sponsored by members of the Liberal Party in Western Australia, and while at a meeting in Kununurra, a town in the north of Western Australia, I was approached by two missionaries and a group of Aborigines. The two missionaries were Don and Meg Shedley, evangelical missionaries, and they said, we would like to sponsor a tour for you to speak among the Aborigines. That is, to go to the settlements in the reserve areas and hear what the Aborigines have got to say. And I must say that I was more than surprised, despite my background, as to just how far things had gone. I think you all know how they've closed border areas and the land rights areas already, where you have to have a visa or call it a permit or what you want to get in. But in some places that I went to with Don and Meg Shedley in the Kimberley, we had to wait outside the border of the reserve because Christian missionaries were not allowed to go in. And Christian Aborigines had to go in to bring other Aborigines out to meet us. While this was going on, there would be carloads of white activists could drive freely in and out of the areas. You've got left-wing so-called anthropologists preaching the old culture to the Aborigines. I want to put it to you that those Aborigines and Christian missionaries deserve our support. And in order that you would give them support, it is necessary to know something of what they are fighting about. I can't talk to you in any knowledgeable way as a biblical student or a person knowledgeable about theological questions, but I can tell you what I have observed and what I have had evidence of from missionaries and from the Aborigines. Now, before going to Western Australia on this tour with the missionaries, I had the opportunity of speaking to one of the experts among the missionaries, highly respected by all the different missionaries, no matter what their particular persuasions were, and that was Pastor Albrecht, who passed away just a couple of months ago. He was 89 when I saw him, an experienced Lutheran missionary who went to Central Australia in 1924. And I wanted to know from him just what is it that you missionaries do for those Aborigines? How is it that you move into an area which is stricken with alcoholism and violence, and then somehow or other you turn the tables, and almost within 24 hours you've got a new society of people who are living together happily, alcoholism no longer exists, violence is stopped, and so on. And the old chap was terribly proud of himself as he gave me the first actual example and experience that he had of it. On his visit to Central Australia in 1924, the first group of Aborigines he came across included a young Aboriginal girl who was dying of yaws. Now, he knew what the treatment was because he'd already also had medical training. But his problem was that this girl believed that she was willed to die, that she was under a spell, and no medical treatment would have cured her. And you should appreciate that, as he explained it to me, that under tribal law, the Aborigines lived in constant fear of evil spirits, spells being cast on them, the featherfoot men, Katecha men, and they never believed that diseases were caused by anything else than spells being cast on them either by individuals or other groups. And when anyone died, they believed that they'd been willed to die. So what Pastor Ulbrich had to explain to this girl was how that if she surrendered herself to Christ, that she would have a God more powerful than all these other evil spirits. Well, he was very proud of the fact that he did convince her to become a Christian, and he was then able to cure her. And he was equally proud of the fact that she then got married, had 8 children, and they've all got children, all running around Alice Springs today. He told me a lot more. I asked him about how to identify what are called sacred sites or sites of significance, etc. His evidence to me and his advice turned out to be right on this tour, where I had a unique opportunity of talking directly to the Aborigines. I've got some 40 tapes, all taken in the presence of witnesses who are Aboriginals and missionaries, in which the Aborigines explained to me why they wanted Christianity, about the war that is taking place against Christianity on all of the settlements. As one young chap said to me, and he's got his young son in front of him, he said, you know, I've only been a Christian for 11 months, and this is the first time I've ever been happy and free in my life. He explained how they'd cured him of alcoholism, how he'd surrendered himself to Christ. The missionaries explained that in their view this means the Holy Spirit enters them. Now, whatever it does, it's quite remarkable. I can only state that mathematically, I couldn't have any other explanation of how people could change an entire ethical and moral approach virtually in a matter of hours. And he explained to me how he'd gone through his initiation into tribal life. He explained the terror as a young person of having to be careful everywhere he walked in case he went to the wrong place. He was frightened of spirits and everything. And frightened when a corroboree that if he dropped something he'd get speared. Frightened of devils and the evil spirits, which he is no longer frightened of. He now feels comfortable and happy looking after his son. And he explained to me too, just one example of what the Christians call the Holy Spirit coming to them. He said his method of entertaining his young boy, which is a custom among Aborigines, would be to break the legs of a joey, young kangaroo, and give him a stick to poke at it for cruelty. And these Aborigines, when they go Christian, they start looking after their wives. They adopt the concept of the Christian nuclear family. They seem to have absolutely no problem of coping with alcoholism, and they put an end to violence. And the other point that Pastor Ulbrich explained to me was the application of the Christian doctrine of reconciliation, in that they would get the various fighting groups together, whether they be tribes or what, and they would explain to them that this Christian God was so powerful that those fights among them and the issues they fought over were of absolutely no significance. This Christian God could solve it all for them. The point is that it actually works. Now, that's a question of the utter irresponsibility of the federal government of saying in the name of self-determination that things should be taken out of the hands of the missionaries and the Christian Aborigines. That in the name of self-determination and giving dignity, so-called, to the Aborigines, that they should return to the old culture which the Aborigines do not want. As a matter of fact, what is being considered now is to bring Aboriginal girls on a tour through the capital cities to say why they do not want this white man's inspired initiative to go back to the old culture, because they don't want to go and marry the old blokes. They like the idea of a young man of their own choice, and they want modern medicine and not the humbug of bone pointing and witch doctors, etc. Now, I mentioned to you that I have produced a book called The Evidence. Now, in that, among other things, I have shown how the communist movement, including the declarations from Moscow, which were adopted by the Communist Party in Australia, how you had to be very careful, and I was taught this in the Communist Party. We were all atheists. We were taught that in our criticisms of the churches, we had to go very careful, because we didn't want to what they called sectarianism. We didn't want to be sectarian and isolate ourselves. But one group they never let up on in their hatred, and that was the missionaries and the missions among the Aborigines. And it's obvious when you tour the settlements and you hear all of the evidence that I did, and I'll tell you this, I not only went to settlement after settlement, but I spoke to a whole convention of Aborigines, or rather moved around talking to them for 7 days. That was at Port Augusta last January. The missionary said I had to go there in order to finalise my studies. And the thing is that communism has got no hope at all among the Australian Aborigines while Christianity is there. And apart from sheer irresponsibility and lack of even human feeling towards the welfare of Aborigines, and of course it's the same thing with whites. I mean, we know that our civilisation is based on Christianity. It is really a question of getting the Aborigines back to what Christians might call a pagan or Stone Age belief, because communism cannot coexist with Christianity. I'd only repeat what seems to me to be quite miraculous, and I have no explanation of the effect that Christianity has on them, but the Aborigines do. I appeal to you, those of you particularly in churches, that you should get missionaries, say from the United Missionaries Association of Western Australia, to come and address you, to get full-blood Aborigines to come and speak to you, to get their voice heard. One of the points I've made in Red Over Black is that if you wanted to hear the voice of the true Aborigine in Queensland, that you had to read newspapers like Queensland Country Life, because they were the papers where Aborigines told them what they really thought. The journalists in the major newspapers weren't even interested in talking to them. It comes as a surprise to most people to know that the Queensland Aborigines voted overwhelmingly to support the type of land tenure legislation that the Queensland government has. And I note that in the trade union movement, we are used to organising disputes. It's one of our jobs. We know how to organise demonstrations, etc. And by that means of deductive observation, we could ourselves, the Melbourne Trades Hall, when the build-up to the boycott of the Brisbane Games was on, we could see there the biggest promotion ever made in Australian history to put on a dispute. They had the support of the major television stations and the newspapers. Charlie Perkins was talking about bloodshed in the streets. Hell was going to play. They were going to have thousands of Aborigines. Now, if there was any way possible to get those thousands of Aborigines to demonstrating at Brisbane, then they had all the backup to do it. And all they could get was a relative handful of Aborigines at the front, hardly any of them full-blood Aborigines, so I've got nothing against urban Aborigines. Nobody has. They'd be stupid if they did. They're all our brothers and sisters. But the point is, what was demonstrated with these hundreds of whites behind a handful of Aborigines, that this land rights movement had no support among the Aborigines. While Don and Meg Shedley and I were going through the Kimberley, and we spent 9 days and 9 nights going around in a Toyota truck, we never came across any settlement that was supporting this land rights campaign. One reason being that they've already got land rights, which all Aborigines have got in Australia who require them. But at the same time, there was a campaign being run by an organisation calling itself the Kimberley Land Council. And they were claiming sovereignty over the whole of the Kimberley, claiming that they represented the Aborigines, which they did not. They got plenty of government finance to do this. The revolutionary movement among Aborigines is paid by you, the taxpayer. They get jobs in representing health organisations, so-called, etc., people who couldn't put a bandage on, running around well paid and well assisted by cars, etc., promoting a land rights movement which is alien both to the Aborigines themselves as individuals who want to live together with Australians, and manipulated by a quite alien force that is out to destroy the whole of Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, I repeat to you that what we are discussing is a defence matter. It is up to you to give consideration to it. It's up to you to act on it. And in relation to this, as I said, when we talked about the national and the colonial question, it also dealt with so-called multiculturalism and multiracialism. Now, it's quite absurd for anyone to have anything at all to get against another race of people. It doesn't matter who they are part of one great family of races throughout the planet. But it just so happens that in too large a numbers, they do not live together in a very united way. They have different prides and cultures and so on. If you want to know what a multicultural state is, just look at one in the news now, the Lebanon, or Cyprus, or Sri Lanka. And one of the most extraordinary meetings I attended was only recently in Western Australia. I was talking to Aborigines. And I didn't even know that the migration program from Black Africa had commenced to Australia. In Red Over Black, I explained how we'd been taught about these things in the Communist Party, and I quoted from a more recent Marxist textbook saying that we had to have Negro migration to Australia from Haiti and from Black Africa, which, as anyone would know, would cause the same problems they've got in Britain. We've even been warned by Negroes about it. But these Aborigines were the ones who told me about it. They were very emotionally upset. And I can understand it because they're justifiably proud of the fact that they are Australia's black people. And they know that the government is always talking about jobs for Aborigines, which they don't give them. That they bring Asian migrants to have jobs in the post office and they won't give them to young Aborigines, etc. But they believe that the Negro migration program, which at that time, a few weeks ago, was 140, the first batch, with a promise of many more to come, they believe that's going to make the Australian Aboriginal second fiddle to the Negro. Now, nobody consults with them about it. And what I'm putting to you is that the architects behind this know exactly what they're doing. They know that it causes antagonism among the Aborigines. They know and expect that Australia is going to have the multiracial problems of Britain, and they even hope it will get as bad as what it is in the United States. Now, in order to discuss these questions rationally, we've got to knock this smear of the Australian people that they are racist, and to try and frighten people into not discussing or debating immigration issues, which is a defence matter, because of fear of being branded racist. Likewise, we should look to the evidence that is available to Australia as to how Asian governments and master politicians are treating the migration issue in Australia as distinct from the type of frogs and mice debate that we saw recently or heard recently in the federal parliament, where the real issues were not tackled, where Labor was praising up Malcolm Fraser and his government for having initiated the same scheme that Labor is now pursuing. What we should do is read the evidence from the Asian press itself. The most appropriate one for Australians is one that is sold in our own bookshops and for which you can get copies in any local library, and that is Asia Week. It is the Asian journal that is most widely read that is printed in English in the Asian countries. Now, the March 23rd issue for this year came out with the real views of the manipulators of politics in Asian countries and their views towards Australia. And they were saying that the Australian people are only a relative minority, that this country is too big for such a small people, preparing the way for them to send migration uninvited. And I put it to you that that is an invasion plan. I ask you to read that yourself. And also in the evidence, I've quoted from Bill Hayden, our so-called Minister for Foreign Affairs. Now, he made a statement to Asia Week, the same publication, in which he said that there should be a new race developed in Australia, that because of the Asian migration program, that Asians and whites would intermarry and this new race would appear, a real Dr. Strangelove theory. Anyone who knows Asians, and certainly the journalists who are over there now, say that rather than them thinking that Hayden was paying them a compliment, they felt insulted. They've got no intention of coming to Australia to be guinea pigs, to breed a new race of people. They are quite proud of being Asians. And it's remarkable that this government is so concerned about the preservation of every breed of kangaroo and goanna, but that somehow or other the human race should be absorbed into one race, like getting all the parrots together to make them all one colour. All that sounds weird, and it is weird, and we're talking about people with a long-range objection of the destruction of our society. I would refer you again to my book, Red Over Black, where we were taught this theory in the Communist Party, that a new race should be bred in Australia of Asians and whites. That's nothing against Asians or white people, but it is against the manipulators who want to destroy us. Ladies and gentlemen, what I have discussed with you tonight, I would repeat, is a defence matter. The issue of land rights is to establish a separate, independent nation to be recognised by the United Nations. The migration program is the preparation of an invasion plan. The idea of multiculturalism and multiracialism is to break up the homogeneity of our nation, to mean that we face inevitable defeat. Fortunately, the Australian people are waking up to what it is all about. We've still got a long way to go. We can't have a position where we would re-elect a new federal government that would behave the same as the Fraser government did. And I'm not having a go at any political party. I'm only stating what the issues are. Those of you who come from different ranks, whether you're employers, farmers, or what you are, we all have common interest in the defence of the country. I speak to you as a union man. You may be what you like, but we're all Australians, and this is the basic issue that we have to confront now. One last thing I want to again repeat, that the war to break Christianity among the Aborigines is part and parcel of a quite despicable act against both the Aborigines and us. And those Christian Aborigines, such as represented by the Christian Aboriginal Evangelical Fellowship and the white missionaries who support them, they deserve the support of all their fellow citizens throughout the Commonwealth. It would be a very lengthy process to explain how someone actually breaks from the Communist Party, how they wake up to them, because you're very heavily indoctrinated, and as I've since found out, the process by how you have been brainwashed doesn't become clear until long afterwards. And that when you are being brainwashed, you don't really know what's happening to you. The communist leaders and their lecturers and tutors, they know exactly how to carry out this process of indoctrination of the membership. They go to schools of instruction in Russia and China for a year, 18 months or up to 3 years, in which they are taught these techniques. And you have people such as myself, who you would refer to as a card-carrying mug, who would not know what has happened to him until often much longer afterwards. But myself and other communists conflicted with the party when such tumultuous events took place as the Hungarian uprising in 1956, and we had the uprisings of the workers in Poland and East Berlin, and among other shocks was that we found out that they never had any unions in the communist countries. In fact, the only unions they've had in any of the communist countries were in Poland, and they only lasted for 3 months. And we found out that the people who came to visit Australia, allegedly representing Soviet building worker unions, metal trade unions and so on, that they were in fact intelligence officers from the communist countries. And of course, another thing that a union official has got to his advantage, if he's a communist, is that he's able to see the alternative to Marxian economics and socialist theory by observing how capitalism actually provides the jobs. That is, the entrepreneurial employer who creates out of his initiative a small industry, and perhaps a bigger industry later on, how he creates jobs. And because of the evidence that you have of the economy in arbitration court cases and so on, you are able to see the contradictions in the propaganda that you're taught in the Communist Party. And you begin to recognise the superiority of the free enterprise system over anything that socialism has got to offer. You realise that socialism doesn't work. And the people who take over industries in the communist countries are, in fact, corporate aristocrats, something quite alien to the Australian tradition. On the question of what land rights should be granted to Aborigines, I went and saw a Mr. Rod Schenck, whom I was told by the other missionaries and Aborigines was regarded as the expert on this question. And he said, look, what the Aborigines really need is a block of land of their own. That, of course, is quite distinct from the fact that some Aborigines want to live on settlements. You take it for granted they've all got the right to do that and have sufficient land for it. But he was explaining to me with this wisdom that these missionaries have got, with their acquired knowledge, that the basis of the stability of any society and people is the private ownership of land. And he said that the Aborigine will always be the battler and a sort of underdog until he has his own block of land. Now, he said some of them might make a bit of a mess of it to start off with. But if they're giving their own block of land and they learn to build on it, then they will be on the road to security and stability. He explained to me that a lot of Aborigines are like the battler among the whites. He's always the one who invests his money in depreciable objects, such as refrigerators or motor cars. The ones who get on in the world are those who buy a block of land and build a home, etc. Now, his advice to me was borne out by a visit I made to Leonora, which is a town 70 miles from Kalgoorlie in Western Australia. Mr. Norman Moore, the shadow minister, a Liberal minister, or Liberal member in the West Australian Parliament, suggested I come with him to meet with the leaders of the Aborigines in Leonora. I almost felt embarrassed for him because he was a Liberal, a very decent chap who understands these issues. But these Aborigines were saying to us, look, can't you do something with Fred Chaney? That is Senator Fred Chaney, the Liberal. They said, we've had him here and we've tried to explain to him that we are not communally minded, we are not socialists, that if we want land, we want a block of land of our own. And what they pointed out is that the type of land rights legislation that has been brought in by the Fraser government and supported by Labor means, in fact, the denial of the Aborigine to build his own home and own it, that he, in fact, owns nothing. And you should appreciate the fact that what it really means is that they give land rights collectively owned and inalienable, allegedly, to a collective group. They are saying that the Aborigines are socialists, that they do not have the developed intelligence to be individualists, and that they have to live as a sort of communist community, which they do not want to live. Now, as these Aborigines explained, what happens in the land rights areas where you can't buy your own home, can't even build one or own anything, that there's a row over who has the motor cars that are supplied by the government, TV sets, etc. And people aren't going to value greatly property that is supposedly collectively owned. Now, I would again repeat that, and this is something we as Australians should all do, all recognise it, and that is that the experts on these questions are the missionaries. And we've all been brainwashed, or at least I have and most people I know, by the film industry, where they show you these missionaries as being sort of people up in the clouds, as though they're a bit eccentric. They are just the opposite. They are intellectuals. No mug can be a missionary. You've got to have a lot of knowledge. And I spoke to a great range of them over in Western Australia. People like Wilf Douglas, who was also a leading linguist, an anthropologist, and there are numerous ones like that. 3 marvellous men I met in Derby who are affectionately known by the other missionaries as the 3 wise men. They've retired and they discuss some biblical and evangelical questions among each other. And this remarkable Schenck family. Rod Schenck is one of them. And Don and Esther Milne. And Elizabeth Miller and her husband and others. We should get advice from them. I heard Rod Schenk, for instance, giving a talk to young Aborigines. He runs a training school at Esperance, and I went along this Saturday night, and he's got a certificate presentation to those Aborigines who've been through his school. They've got skills, and they were beautifully dressed and highly cultured young men and women, because they had this Christian background as well as the technical knowledge that he had taught them.